Now, how this is done is something that has changed in recent years, and this is one of the reasons why modern PR can be quite complicated, is because it's in a state of flux. Even when I was in school for public relations 15 years ago or so, I was taught the old model of PR, not because it was wrong, but because that's what was being used professionally still. But within that 15 years, we've really switched over to a new model of PR. The tactics that were used in the past don't really work as well anymore. So this is the kind of field where you really will even see this out in the workforce, that there is a pretty clear line in a lot of organizations between younger, more modern PR professionals who are using this new model and some of the older, more experienced ones who tend to still be using the old model. This is going to make a lot more sense in just a second. So what is old public relations? Old public relations is all about getting the news to cover your organization. So in traditional public relations, the idea was you would get free marketing and publicity for the organization you worked for by doing something newsworthy. So basically what you would do is you would use the news as a commercial, so to speak. And we'll talk more about this in a little bit and why there are some differences between advertising and PR. But basically, you would do something newsworthy. You would hold an event, you would hold a press conference, a golf tournament, you would write letters to the editor, you would write press releases, and the idea is the news would come to these events, they would cover them in the newspaper, in the 6 o'clock evening news, and that's how people found out about what was going on in your organization. This really is the model that's been used through the entirety of the 1900s, really all the way up until the last 10, 15 years, where a PR professional was all about fighting for editorial space. Now, fighting for editorial space basically meant that in a print newspaper, there's only so much space. So you needed to do something interesting enough in your organization to make sure that you would get covered. Or in the evening news, there's only so many minutes of local news that are going to show in the evening news. So you had to do something interesting enough for them to actually show up. For example, I worked for a time for a small local newspaper, and one of my jobs was to be sent on location to do little stories about local events. So things like I would go to the local yard sale that the canine rescue was having, or I would go to the Puerto Rican American cultural celebration. Those are actually 2 events that I really did cover. And how we would pick and choose what events I would be sent to, because I was one of the only traveling reporters for that little paper, was my editor would basically go through all the list of events that were going on that week from the, that were sent in from organizations in the area, and he would pick which ones do we think are going to be the most interesting, which ones will I take the best pictures at, which ones will I get the best interviews at, because I couldn't be at 2 events at one time. So I would have to pick which is the one that I think makes the more sense, or my editor thought made the most sense for our newspaper. So that is absolutely a fight for editorial space. The people putting on those events had to try to put them on in a way that would convince the news to show up. Because if the news didn't show up, they would hold this event and it would still help the community who showed up to the event, but nobody else would know that it really happened. But you have to remember, this was a time really before social media. Nobody was tweeting or Instagramming these events. So if the news didn't show up to cover it, it wasn't out there. You didn't get any sort of publicity from it. So that is the idea of a fight for editorial space. You always had to write things in a way that the newspaper would run your story. You always had to put on events in a way that the news would actually show up. So you'd have to always be worried about doing something newsworthy. What can we do that's going to get the news to show up? Your goal was always to get covered by the news. That was your primary goal, is to get your name out there as much as absolutely possible. So old public relations and practitioners of this older style of PR were really heavily ingrained in the mass media and journalism fields. So a lot of the sort of terminology, a lot of the sort of techniques, a lot of the sort of things that you would learn with these older PR styles, and we'll touch on them a little bit, are very closely related to classes that you would take in, Introduction to Mass Media or in journalism. But again, that's the older style. And the reason why this style doesn't really work anymore is because there no longer is a fight for editorial space. Although we still have print newspapers and you do have a limited number of pages that you could put stories on or photos on, most people aren't getting their news from print papers. They're getting their news from the internet, and the internet is infinite. And although, yes, you still only have so many reporters, people don't really care about the news coming to their event so much anymore because they can just Instagram it. They can make a YouTube channel. They can put it on their Facebook. People can get their own stories out there. So it's no longer a fight for editorial space because the space is there. So now people had to shift over to our newer model of public relations where instead it's a fight for mental space. And this is what ultimately we're going to talk about through most of the semester. The idea of mental space is that we live in a world where there is just stories and information and just stuff happening all of the time. Don't you on a normal day just feel like you're being bombarded with information all of the time? There's just noise and information and advertisements and just voices coming at you from every possible angle. And you can't possibly pay attention to all of it. You certainly can't remember all of it. That is now a fight for mental space. So that means modern practitioners of public relations are fighting for your head, essentially. They're not trying to get the news necessarily to show up to events. They're not really worried about writing press releases quite so much, and that does still happen. But instead, their main job is how do we connect with our audience? Because the more we're able to connect with our audience, the more we're able to build a relationship with our audience, the more we're going to be able to use up their mental space. Ours are the messages they're going to be listening to. Take, for example, the recent explosion of local breweries. I remember just a couple of years ago, there really were only 1 or 2 breweries in Western New York, and now there's like 20. It seems like every weekend I'm hearing about a new event at a new brewery that I had never heard of. So these breweries now have to fight for their audience's mental space. Because there's so many of them and they're all doing similar things, they have to somehow set themselves apart. They have to somehow create a relationship with their audience, because once you create that relationship, you now create brand loyalty. I'm getting a little ahead of myself here. We're going to cover all of this as we get to it. But again, this is just kind of an overview to get you thinking about how this works. So if you're working PR or marketing for one of these breweries, you now need to do something so that people are paying attention to you and not the brewery down the road. Why should they come to you? Why should they come to your event? Why should they come to you for their bachelor party or bachelorette party? Why should they come to you to buy their growlers and kegs for their parties? You have to fight for their mental space. You have to cut through the clutter. You have to cut through all the digital and social media noise that's out there to get to your audience. That is what modern public relations is all about. We're not worried about the news nearly as much because the news can be bypassed. We now can communicate directly with our audience. So now we have to figure out, okay, how do we do that? How we get people's mental space, how we get into their heads, is we partially tell stories. It's all about creating a good narrative. Maybe you're a family organization. Maybe you have strong roots in the community. Maybe you're the new hot thing. Whatever it is, you somehow tell a story. We will also talk about this later. You're also going to use a lot of social media. The social media you choose to use is going to really kind of depend on the type of organization you are. But of course, we have things like different, social media platforms such as Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, obviously, Twitter, obviously. You're going to figure out what type of social media makes the most sense for your audience. A big part of public relations in the modern era is knowing what type of social media works best for your audience. For example, the fact that I just said Facebook versus Instagram and Twitter. Some of you out there may have been like, yeah, I don't even have a Facebook. I know you probably don't, because Facebook tends to be more for older people at this point, and Instagram and Twitter tend to be more for younger people. So depending on what kind of organization you're running, what you want your audience to be, you may gravitate more towards one social media outlet than another. Ultimately, the goal of new public relations is all about building relationships. And this is something we're going to come back to over and over and over again, why this is so important, how do you actually do this? But the bottom line of it is that once you establish a relationship with somebody, relationships are what build trust. If you build a relationship with an organization, you trust that organization, you're loyal to that organization. And as an organization, you want to have a relationship with your customers. Think about it even if you are a YouTuber. You want to build a relationship with your audience. You want them to feel like they know you and you know them. Again, you're going to do this by using contact through social media, by telling stories, by being very human, by being as relatable as possible. It's all about building relationships. And because modern public relations is more about building relationships than creating newsworthiness, we relate it more towards interpersonal communication and psychology and less related to mass media and journalism. Again, those things are still important, but they really take a backseat to all about how do you actually relate to somebody. Psychology is really important. We're going to have an entire unit about social psychology because it's all about understanding how people think. If you understand how people think, you're able to understand their value systems. You're able to understand how you're able to align yourself with those values Even though we're talking about, in some cases, large organizations with millions of followers, you still want to make it feel like you're speaking directly to them. That is then where the idea of interpersonal communication comes in. So the modern PR landscape is very interesting right now because there is still very much a lot of people who follow the old style. And again, just to really stress this, there's nothing necessarily inherently wrong with the old style. It's just not nearly as relevant as using the new style. In fact, one of the reasons we don't have a textbook for this class, beyond the fact that I don't care for textbooks because of how incredibly expensive they are, the markup on them is absolutely insane, but it's also because I had a really hard time finding any sort of textbook that dealt with modern public relations. Most of them all dealt with the old style. So there really is a state of flux in the field right now, which is why we're going to spend so much time really breaking down in this class what PR is and how it actually works. Just to do a side-by-side comparison for you, older PR tends to focus more on utilizing the mass communication. Newer PR tends to use more interpersonal communication tactics. Old PR is about fighting for editorial space or literally newspaper space. New PR is about fighting for mental space. How do you get people to think about you and listen to your message over another? Old PR was more about newsworthiness, doing things that make the news show up. New PR is much more about trust and relevance, making yourself stand out, making yourself relevant, and making sure the audience trusts you. This differentiation is something we're going to see happen a lot when we get to the next unit dealing with history. And the last one is also really interesting because older PR dealt more with reaching big numbers of people who may be uninterested. So that's how basically the broadcast media field works, is that your message is going to be read or heard by possibly hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of people. But out of that group of people, you may only have a very small percentage, maybe 5, 10, 15% of the people who have any interest at all in what it is you're saying or what your organization does. New PR follows the more of the narrow casting idea, where it's much more about reaching a small audience, but it's a highly dedicated audience. So through your social media, you may only be reaching, 2,000 people, but those are 2,000 people that you have a relationship with. Those are 2,000 people who are going to buy from you every time, or who are going to listen to your podcast every time, or donate to you every single time. So although there's not nearly as many people hearing your message, the people who are actually care about it. So that's a really important differentiation as well between the old style of PR and the new style.